Ricardo, I wonder if you want to start. I guess
yes,
people join
I will start in a second. Yes, I was just checking something. And I will be starting this immediately. I'm just closing things that I don't want to disturb us, like the email. Okay, so I will put my face in here. So, yes, we could move on, and I hope that Paula Kahumu will be able to rejoin. So, to you and to the audience that has been increasing since our first webinar last Monday, and that's very good. This is the third of our webinars that will finish next, this series will finish next Monday, on climate change and disinformation, all together within a motto on which Citizens Platform for Climate Change and UNESCO has coincided, which is beyond confusion, which means curbing disinformation and fake news, inspiring action, which is highlighting what is already going on in the world today by many, many thousands of people, and to answer to the question, what can I do? So in the previous webinar, we invited eminent experts to discuss demand-side solutions which target false information, which is already out there. The discussion provided an opportunity to understand how disinformation harms those at the receiving end of the information. Oh, and what can they do about it? Today, we look at the flip side of the equation and examine the supply side solutions, which work on the producers of information to curb the production of false information, prevent its spread, or produce more truth information. These solutions, let's say, could include technological aspects, regulation on producers and disseminators of information, increased transparency about funding and advertising, and counter speech. I would like just to briefly, very briefly, frame the importance of the participants today. I mean, it's a unique circumstance that Clément Boisseau, as representative of a world communications and information and advertising agency called BETC, joins a discussion on disinformation, fake news, and that would illustrate with his particular know-how, sitting as he is in the exact point where producers and consumers meet, which is a fascinating aspect, and it's fascinating to be able to count on that. Dr. Savio created 64 years ago something to curb the unfair, unbalanced flow of information, which was where disinformation and fake news were hiding, let's say. Dr. Martina Kleins brings something very important, which is climate change affects water provision, water generates war. while peace is a fundamental element for sustainable development. And Paula Kahumbu will be the one that shows us the concrete action in a concrete context where things happen, where changes take place, which is at the local level. Massimiliano Falcone, who is a member of Citizens Platform and a communicator, will tell us how Citizens Platform intend, by using social communication and marketing tools on daily basis, curb disinformation and fake news. And finally, I want to introduce Professor Guy Berger, UNESCO's Director for Strategies and Policies at its Communication and Information sector, which probably doesn't reflect the many years Guy Berger's fight coherent, stubbornly for freedom of speech, the defense of journalists and the defense of media, to whom we once and again go to and count on his absolutely coherent statue of a fighter. So he will be introducing more in details each panelist, but let me say that it's an absolute honor to count on Guy as a moderator. Guy, please. You have to put your, no, you're still mute.
Right.
There.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you all the participants and attendees and my colleagues for setting this up and working with you, Ricardo, and the Citizens Initiative and IPS. So I think we're going to have a great discussion, and I really want to encourage as many people as possible to use the chat. So post comments in the chat, post questions in the chat. Keep that as a very vivid and vibrant parallel channel to us as we carry on with this discussion. And at the end, we'll also be responding to those comments and questions in the chat. So let me just introduce the subject a little bit from a UNESCO point of view. As I think people know, we're focusing on the supply side of information and disinformation today. So we're not looking so much at the distribution, the circulation, the transmission, and we're not looking at the reception so much. We're looking at what it means to be active in the supply side. In other words, where there's the creation of information, of disinformation, and of misinformation. And of course, we know that the people who create disinformation and misinformation, eventually they want to have it reaching audiences with the effect of either confusing audiences and making them cynical, or getting audiences to believe the disinformation and the misinformation, and even to recirculate it. Now, of course, in this big picture of production, transmission, reception, we need interventions in all of them. We need to, for example, put limits on the distribution, the transmission of disinformation. But today we're looking at the source. Where does it start? Because it starts somewhere before it comes to transmission. And so we're looking at the original sin, as it were, where bad information is produced and where good information is produced. Now, because of course we're concerned about the bad information, which I use in quotes, but I'll explain it a bit later. There are two things we can do at the moment of production. One, we can reduce the supply side of bad information, and two, we can increase the good side. So in terms of the first one, reducing the supply side, of course, there are some people who would want to criminalize and outlaw and make illegal the production of disinformation on a range of topics. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but it is very complex as to how workable that is, and also whether it's desirable to have a generalized criminalization of fake news or other falsehoods because of the danger of misapplication and ending up suppressing legitimate debate, satire, and even penalizing people who are just misinformed, who are not really intending to harm society. So reducing the supply side of bad information, it's a complex issue, and I think that's not really what we're looking at today. I think we're looking today at increasing the supply side of good information. And by that, I mean two things. Supply of verified information. I'm very glad we've got people here who can also tell us not enough to have verified information, it must be engaging information. Clement Boisseau, I'm looking at you, but we'll come to you in a minute. So, increasing the supply side with verified and engaging information. Secondly, increasing the supply side of corrections, of debunks, of information that can set the record straight. So here we are, we're going to look particularly at the supply side of good information. Now, to advance science in its service of sustainable development, broadly speaking, we have been encouraged as humanity to, and I quote here, flood the zone. In other words, to take the public sphere and flood it with good information. In fact, if you hear the UN has an initiative called shareverified.com, shareverified.com, which is exactly this agenda, to flood the zone. If you go to that site, shareverified.com, and you look at their content, you'll see the head of the UN Environmental Program there who says, we have listened to science with COVID, now let's listen to science on nature and climate. Very good points, important messages to make. Now, if we don't flood the zone, I think the tidal wave of disinformation and misinformation will bury us. It will bury science, it will nullify vaccines against COVID, and it will delay the many actions that are needed to preserve our environment and to combat climate change. When you come to health science, the UN is at the moment putting a lot of energy, of course, into flooding the zone, as with this verified initiative. And at UNESCO, we've sought to increase the supply of engaging information through a campaign called Don't Go Viral, along with African musicians, which has logged about 216 million hits on social media in Africa. That's super. We've also been working with journalists, and we've trained 9,000 journalists worldwide through a MOOC in covering COVID with a scientific point of view. And in regard to the environment, we've produced customized handbooks and training for hundreds of journalists on how to cover climate change worldwide, especially in Asia, Africa, and coming up in the Caribbean. I'll post the link in the chat to that shortly. So in the UN system, we're trying to do things, to flood the zone with verified information, with engaging information that's relevant to the role of science in sustainable development. In particular, we need more if we're going to have an impact in this area of climate change. And to do that, we need to have more knowledge about what lies behind the problem of bad information in regard to climate change. We need to know who's behind the production of this bad information. To what extent is it officials? To what extent is it corporations? To what extent is it individuals? AstroTurf groups? What extent is it misguided social movements? So we need to understand them because we have to monitor them and see what kind of content they're producing and how we can flood the zone with counter content. And then we also need to know who can be part of the solution. The journalists, the scientists themselves to become communicators, the public, which of course is the citizens platform that is partnering with UNESCO with these. So we have to understand who's who and why in the realm of production. So I'm sure we're going to hear some interesting points of view on this and why it matters. So in the webinar, which we're now going to start, we're going to run 2 rounds with the speakers. In the first round, I want them especially to focus on analyzing the problem, the problems that we face at the production level of good content, the production level of identifying who's producing the bad content and so on. Help us understand the problem at source. And in the second round, I'd like the speakers to please give your emphasis to solutions. What are some of the solutions, especially with upscaling the good content, upscaling the debunking content, producing more engaging content. So first round, analysis problem. Second round, focus on the solutions. Okay, excellent. Now I'm just going to, if you bear with me, I'm going to open the chat, and I see nobody commenting in the chat yet. So here's the challenge to you all. Please start putting your opinions in there. Keep this thing vibrant. If there's anything I said you have a view on, please put it forward in the chat. Okay, let's come to our first speaker, Mr. Clement Boisseau. He is, let me just see my note here, Director of Strategic Planning at the BETC. I guess it's BETC Agence.
Exactly, yeah.
Good. Which is very much involved in doing design for clients such as Air France, Evian, Lacoste, Canal Plus, and has won various awards. And I'm going to come back to him in the second round, so I'm going to ask him now to tell us a little bit, not more than 5 or 6 minutes, please, how he sees the problem. And here's a special sort of challenge to him. Are some advertising agencies part of the problem in the sense of producing content for those who have an interest in climate disinformation? Clement, floor is yours. 5 minutes, please. And I'll wave my hands like this when you're getting close to your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this introduction. First of all, and before trying to answer your question, I wanted to thank Ricardo for inviting me to participate to this panel, because it could be a little bit counterintuitive to invite someone who's working in what I consider as the wonderful world of advertising. But I think it's the proof that first you have an open-minded spirit, and it is also the proof that we are all concerned by the climate change issue, and that we'll need all the energies, all the wills, all the skills to contribute solving this structural problem. And indeed, before sharing with you my point of view on how advertising agency and communication specialists can contribute to this fight for a more sustainable world, I would like to acknowledge a fact that we can't deny, and it's that advertising agency can be part of the problem we want to solve. And of course, our goal will become to be part of the solution. We can be part of the problem for I would say at least 2 reasons. The first one is, of course, that we produce information for corporations which sometimes have a goal which is not the one we want to achieve, because we want to maintain a certain business model which can be against what we try to do in order to solve climate change. But for me, it's not the biggest problem we have to face, and I will touch base on that. For me, the second reason which can make us part of the problem is that with advertising, with communication, we establish a very clear link between communication and consumption, and between communication and hyper-consumption, because we stimulate consumers' desires for things that maybe are not super useful, and it contributes to the belief that there's a kind of magical equation between consumption and happiness. But I think that all the reasons that make advertising agency part of the problem are exactly the same reasons that can make them potential part of the solution. And I would say that there's a few reasons that can demonstrate that point. The first thing is that
Clement, sorry,
yes?
it's Guy here. I want you to hold your solutions till your second speech. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Can I ask you a question now in the problems?
Yes, yes.
As you said, sometimes advertising agencies can be part of the problem by promoting hyperconsumption. And sometimes, I guess, advertising agencies are for hire by, for example, not to single them out, big oil. Big oil may have an interest in spinning the story, but is this intrinsic to advertising, that advertising goes with those who will pay the money? Or do advertisers have a code of ethics, or is there a lack of a code of ethics? Is that part of the problem?
So actually, to be totally honest, we have a code of ethics. And even if we do communication for oil companies, I think that it's not so bad in itself, because when you do communication, you make information available and public. And honestly, I'm not sure that it would be a progress to stop talking. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm much more worried by companies who do not speak rather than by companies who speak. Because when you speak, when you say something, when you use your advertising agency to promote a message, it's the beginning of a conversation, and it's the beginning of a way to expose yourself to a conversation and to critics and to criticism. So I think that even if you produce content which is supposed to convince people to do something, it's the beginning of a conversation and of a journey towards confronting yourself to different points of view. When you draft and when you distribute messages to the people, you expect and you accept that they can reject your message. But I think the most important thing is to start dialoguing with people. So even if sometimes advertising agency can go where the money goes, as you say, their job in itself is a beginning of a solution, because it's a beginning of a conversation. Okay. And on top of that, I think that, but I think it's a super interesting debate and conversation. We do not do advertising and communication for all the products. And for instance, you could completely imagine that we do not do communication for products which have very bad carbon footprint, and which are going to be prohibited. We do not do communication for products which are prohibited. So there's a kind of general framework and some rules.
Well, thank you for that. I think you really helped us understand part of the role of advertising agencies at the source. And I guess before we come back to you for more of the solutions, I just had one other quick question, understand the problem a little bit more. And this is my question to you. We're focusing here particularly on science and the role of science and the power of science. And I guess science works very much the level of information, rationality, and so on. Whereas advertising works more with the heart, not so much with the head, but with the heart, doesn't it? So is there a problem for advertising agencies to try to communicate science at the level of the head when their biggest power is at the level of engagement with people's emotions?
It's a very good question, and actually I would say it's much more complicated than what you say, because
I'm sure.
No, it's just because when you do communication, when you do advertising, of course you want to engage people. So, but the drivers to leverage in order to engage people are both rational and emotional. Of course, it's super important to create an emotion, so to talk to the heart. But people, and when we try to sell products to people, they become consumers, they are also very rational. So it's not true to say that we only leverage emotions to make them buy or understand something, because they are pragmatic, they are concrete people. So they want to combine two types of information, rational and emotional. And when you communicate for a company, the first question I ask to my client is what are, of course, the emotional, but also the very rational purpose, the usefulness, the utility you provide to people. So I think it's really a mix of both. And I think it's, of course, very complex, because when you talk about science, it's super rational and sometimes it's super complex. And when you try to deliver a message, you have to catch people's attention, and it's super complicated to deal with complexity. Indeed. So I think that maybe but I anticipate on the part of the solution, but we can help not to simplify complexity, but to make it understandable by people.
Super, thank you. So I think you have convinced me in my head and in my heart that advertising is not more orientated towards the emotional, and therefore it's not a skewed playing field for science. because you can have science in there. So thank you for that. So I understand the problem, and the nature of advertising is not necessarily against the rationality of science. Thank you. Okay, I see we do have Paula Kahumbu joining us. Thank you, Paula. It's great to have you on. Just to indicate, as I told the other speakers, we will have 2 rounds of comments. The first ones, we're looking at the problems, and then I'll come back to you for the solutions later. So let me introduce you, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us a bit about how you see the problem of bad information. And particularly, I think you probably speak about where do children fit in, and how can, I'm assuming this, how can we deal with the problem of children encountering bad information or disinformation, misinformation. Now, the reason why I'm saying that too is because you're the CEO of Kenyan conservation NGO called Wildlife Direct. You lead the Hands Off Our Elephants campaign. You are campaigning to restore Kenyan leadership in elephant conservation. And you're a writer and a co-author of a global best-selling children's book that I'm particularly asking you about. Help us understand the problem in terms of this bad information about climate and environment and nature issues vis-a-vis children. And then we'll come back to how you see some of the solutions in the next round. Over to you. You need to unmute your mic, and you have 5 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sorry I was late. I think that the issue of climate change in Africa, and I can speak primarily from Kenya, but I think it's the same challenge over many of the more developing parts of Africa, that the amount of information and the quality of the information is very limited. When I'm going to start at the highest level, just the general public. In our countries, there is almost no information about climate change through the traditional media, newspapers or television, radio, because most of the news is very political, and often when there is bad news, it's treated as if it's something that is external to Africa, that this is a problem caused by the West. Climate change, emissions, ozone, all these things are not really seen as a problem caused by African countries. In fact, on the contrary, in most African countries and most African people are being advised that the future and our aspirations can only be achieved if we go the route of developed nations, and particularly very, very rapidly growing emerging countries like China or India, Brazil, that we should be doing much more industry, and our national values and our plans, like our master plan for Vision 2030, is really hinged on development, infrastructure, industry. What we've seen is a very downplaying of matters related to climate change, and elevation of any matters that might address job creation or GDP increase. And this idea that GDP is the end goal is something that we hear about a lot. The costs of these developments are I think, where most of the misinformation is. The real cost to the environment, number one. We don't hear about the long-term consequences of the construction of coal power plants, for example. We've seen efforts in East Africa now to establish a coal economy. Our country in Kenya, most of our energy comes from much more sustainable sources. Hydroelectricity, geothermal is huge, wind power and solar power. But we're seeing a move by industry being financed by big banks, especially Chinese, to build coal power plants. And not only is the information incorrect that we need this kind of power, but the quality of this technology is another part of the problem. That the technology that we're being sold is the latest, the most advanced, and the cleanest possibly coal power there is out there. You know, it's misinformation at the highest level. It's coming from government, and it's coming through the big industrialists in the country. And the efforts by conservationists to challenge this are being dismissed. What we see in schools when it comes to children is, you know, basically it's a vacuum of information. Children are not given education around climate change and the sources of climate change. Instead, this information is more around to solve these problems, all you've got to do is plant some trees. Everybody should go out there and plant trees. And if you look at Kenya's climate agenda, it's all about planting more trees. If we had 10% of our country in tree cover, then we'll be fine. In fact, if you look at what's happening in terms of sources of climate vulnerability, the vulnerability of people in Africa is very high. Already they are poor. Already we don't have very well forested areas, especially here in Kenya. We're losing our forests at a rate of about 7% per year, humid forests. But there's a great effort to plant trees, but there isn't a great effort to stop the destruction of forests. Instead, what we're seeing is more development in our forest areas and arguments being pushed as to why we need to do this. Most of the time, and if you look at the Big Four agenda for my country, which the whole country has supported, it's related to industry and industry development. Why? Because this generates jobs. We need jobs because our population demographic is very young. We have 1 million young people looking for jobs every year. The industry will give them these jobs. If you look at the environmental sector, which actually can create a lot of jobs, you don't see much priority placed on that. And these are the kind of challenges that that we hear about. We don't hear about our role and responsibility towards climate change. And we also don't hear about the need for climate adaptation and climate mitigation in a way that is making a lot of sense. We don't hear about the costs, the real costs of climate and these developments that are altering the climate, for example, on agriculture and food security, or on health and the cost of health in our countries. So these are some of the challenges we face, and as an organization.
Thank you, Paula. Sorry to cut you off for now, just in terms of time management, but I think you made your points very, very clearly, and it struck me that you're saying that there's an omission, lack of information in the people aren't producing the right information. The journalists aren't producing, you said the news is not producing this. The schools don't have materials produced that they could use for that. At the same time, you said that there's a production of information which is spinning all the benefits of a non-green growth path, I guess. And so that's, I think, gives us a lot of insight into the complexity of addressing the production of bad information and the lack of production of good information. So that was really useful. Let's come back and see what solutions you might have to that when we come to our second round. So let me move on now to Dr. Martina Climes, who's works as an advisor on water and peace. Particularly is concerned about water scarcity and political tensions and armed violence, and has looked at how disinformation around these issues is creating growing problems for transboundary water cooperation. So Martina, please give us your take on the problems, particularly focused on the production level. And of course, we know some of the consequences, but let's look at the zone of information, disinformation in this area, and then we'll come later to your solutions. So 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be participating in this very important event. And I think that maybe has been said during this conference already, that it is very important that we talk to public about this problem, because we really need to secure public's ownership of this and really change the mindset. And this is a very important step forward. And as said, I work at the Stockholm International Water Institute, and therefore I will really zoom in on examples from water scarcity and transboundary water issues. Just to introduce it, you can imagine that this is a very complex environment when there is not enough data. We don't have enough data on how these regions affected by water scarcity, how they will be affected by climate change and climate variability. this data is just, it's very difficult to get verified data and to get everybody on the same page. At the same time, we have these regions that usually have weak institutions and that are faced with many other problems. So this creates, and now when we really look at this supply side, so I would like you to think of this, that this environment really creates a very enabling environment for spread of misinformation. Because it is really something that's affecting a key resource. Water is life. Water is essential for food security, employment security, national security. And we don't have enough information about what's going to happen. So this situation creates a lot of enabling environment for different groups, both government and non-state, who really exploit this information vacuum that we just don't know how will really the future be shaped. And this is why it's so easy to spread misinformation about these issues in this fragile region. So really think about this enabling environment on the supply side. So why is it that misinformation really thrive in this environment? We see increasing environmental pressures, and this is combined with weak communication, lack of transparency, and low trust between government and public. And this often is because these governments in these regions that are, imagine different parts of the Middle East that are also affected by many other challenges. So it's very difficult to be prioritizing how to shape communication strategies with the general public about complex reforms, for example, about the need to change irrigation schemes, about the need to change the crops that we are growing, because we no longer cannot afford to grow these water-intensive plants. So it requires a lot of investment into this, and I will talk about it in the second part. But really think about this lack of trust between the government and public side. There is no trust in the information that is floating around, and that's why misinformation really thrives. We also see a low scientific literacy among decision makers. It's very difficult if you think about the complex knowledge that's available and complex studies, and then think about those who really make decisions and how to transfer this. How do we transfer this? What we need needs to be done, and how do we bring it in a very consumable form to those who can make decisions? Again, this creates a lot of opportunities for misinformation. And this is being exploited by actors who have their own vested interests. It can be economic interest, political interest, and other interest, and how they take that they are taking advantage of this, and then that there is really a lack of communication, there is lack of data, and at the same time, it's very easy to access different communication platforms. It's very easy, even we see even in regions which lack many other goods, but there is a self-reception, there is access to different communication platforms, which we like that is good. We do want people to be connected, but then how do we really deal with this very difficult situation when we have when we just don't have the information on something very complex? If we think about transboundary water cooperation, these are very complex processes. It's not only about hydrology. It's not only about how much water we will have in 50 years. It's also about how much water we will need. What will be our population? How will the industry change? How will our agriculture change? How will our trade change? How will our relations with our neighbors change? And this creates a very complex, multidisciplinary environment. And that makes it difficult to find a very simple and effective way. How do we communicate about these challenges? And at the same time, also about very unpopular reforms that will need to be adapted to the general public. We've seen examples that, for example, non-state actors like ISIS, Daesh have exploited the situation that some communities faced with drought, and they were spreading misinformation. What caused the drought? Because there's just not general knowledge, and it's very difficult for the government to get this fairly complex scientific information to some communities. And then it's being exploited in a very cruel manner. So really we need to focus and think about the enabling environment. What is it that makes the misinformation thrive? Why do we see that they are being spread? So
thank you so much, Martina. That was really, really interesting. And I was taking notes while you were talking. And you really unpacked the problem. I think you spoke about the lack of transparency, lack of trust. You spoke about that some information would be unpopular and therefore it's not forthcoming. You spoke about the instrumentalization of some stuff for reasons, as you said, Daesh is doing. You spoke also about complexity. I hope Clement will help us when he comes back about how complexity can be conveyed in a manner that doesn't simplify, but it does make it accessible. But we've definitely got a big knot of problems that you have identified with great significance. So, okay, I'm putting a question in the chat here because I'm still not seeing any vibrant people. We have 60 people online, and I'm seeing people using Q&A, which is great. You can use the chat as well for not just questions and comments, but for quizzes and give your views. So let's move on, and we'll come back, of course, as I said, to the issue of solutions. So now we have Dr. Massimiliano Falcone. He's Director, External Relations, the Citizens Platform on Climate Change and the Sustainable World. He's also a Professor of Public Affairs and International Marketing and Communication at Italian universities in Milan and Roma. So Massimiliano, please, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, help us understand the problem.
Well, I'm trying to understand the problem, listening to the panelists here. Guy, you were saying at the beginning, you were speaking of science, how science is relevant. The problem, science and scientists, who are an important part of the problem. The problem, according me, has to do, and according us, with scientists without a conscience. So using ethics and science. What's science nowadays and what's scientific communication? Listening to Paula, she was saying, in my country, there is not a clear information regarding climate change and environmental problems, and we are more vulnerable. There is not the right information, and this connects to what Martina was saying. There is a lack of trust in governments in some countries. So I was starting from what Guy you were saying and Paula and Martina, in order to connect the first two pillars of the problem. Which are governments, so how the policymakers are ruling their countries basing on the economic situation in those countries, and so how information, how do they deal with information in those countries, and scientists who are sometimes, because research and innovation in some countries like Italy itself, for instance, or Europe, are based not so much on private investments, but on government investments. So they, let's say, drive the direction of information somehow. And there is the other problem here. Later, I would like to connect with Clement and go back to how communication, because communication is fundamental. Advertising has to do with all the private sector, which is the other important stakeholder that we are still not speaking of, and it will be important to look at advertisement as a solution, communication as a solution, because there is the other problem, which is journalism. I see there Roberto Savio, who is the founder of an independent way of looking through critical thinking at reality. What's missing nowadays? I spent my first 8 years, almost 10 years, of activities in Reuters. So I've been working for Reuters when Reuters was Reuters. Something was changing. Something was changing when information became the driver of the markets. So when information became for profit, let's say, and that's why I was highlighting the role of Roberto Savio here, of Ricardo himself. So the problem with journalists is from freedom from bias. Maybe they are free of acting, but they are not really free because they don't really see they are the output of the culture of their backgrounds, and sometimes of know-how, because transforming something that science should tell in something which is useful to be understood and appealing for the masses is really difficult. So if there is a scientist without conscience, and if we have a journalist who has not the know-how and sometimes maybe not the will, he doesn't want to transfer some messages, it becomes really a bigger problem. And the last pillar are the citizens. We are speaking a lot of citizens. The platform is called Citizen Platform, and we are speaking of the citizen journalism since years. But who are the citizens? The citizens are the output of all these things together, because who is creating the cosines, the know-how in the citizens? Media, education, so governments, and the investments going in some directions or in others. So I'm not saying that citizens are a passive part, and nowadays, and I close my 5 minutes, we are looking at a new trend, which are the young generations, which is something we're still not speaking of, that will be, from my viewpoint, in this case personal, the sixth pillar. So young generations that through social media and striking and so on, Fridays for Future are one of the examples, but just one of the examples. How do they perceive the reality, and how they could change the way we do journalism, citizen journalism, and how they are voters, how they could change our governments. I quit because I was just speaking of a bad word, but I hope we can look at solution altogether later.
Thank you. Yes, we're going to be coming to the solution shortly. And I want to just comment on one of the things you said about the journalists. And it strikes me that, scientists always know that there's more to be discovered, there's more to be confirmed, that what's true today may be shown to evolve tomorrow. And journalists don't always understand this. They may think that the facts are the facts, and they need to balance the facts, and they have a false balance between one denialist and the mass of scientists, and that journalists don't always get it, that they are who they are, and they work in an industry which has a certain limits on the way they can produce information and the way they need to compete. And that is part of the problem. And I see in the Q&A and in the chats, people have been raising this question of the media and to what extent the media is part of the problem. So that's a good segue into Roberto Savio. Roberto, he is the founder of Interpress Services that everybody here should know about. Also founder of Technological Information Pilot System, TIPS, Network National Information Systems for Latin America and the Caribbean, Latin America Feature Service, and Women's Feature Service. And he is President Emeritus for IPS. So Roberto Savio, tell us your assessment of the problem. And I guess you're going to, don't tell us yet that IPS is the solution. We come to that later. But tell us about the problem now. From the production side, the problems of production of bad content and the problems of production of facing the production of good content. You need to unmute, Roberto.
Okay. Guy, I think that we have to start from a very basic point, that we are in the area of communication for the first time in history. Before we were in information, not on communication. It was a different world, a vertical world where we journalists send material to a lot of recipients who did not have any capability of any feedback. Now, when the net came out, we were all enthusiastic because it looked like something horizontal, which could put together everybody and create even a global citizen. Now, if we go to the debate of the new international information order, and we read the McBride report today, we see that it has nothing to do with our life. It is a different era, which is gone. It's the Gutenberg era. We are now in the Zuckerberg era. Now, the Zuckerberg era is bringing some things to refer to Massimiliano's point. I doubt that there are citizens like they were in the information era. Citizens today have become objects and consumers. The hijacking of internet by the big tech has created. And my second point is that we will never solve the problem of fake news if we do not solve some problem of an ethic structure of the big tech. I agree with you that to introduce elimination of fake news can be used in different ways from what we intend and would be especially important in countries with authoritarian places to do the opposite of what we think. But something different is the big tech. The big tech live in a free country, and unless we do not get them to accept some code of ethics and act consequently, I mean, we are in a situation where Trump has become what has become and is running for election because he has 67 million followers a day in Twitter. All American media made 60 million, and of this, only 10 million are of quality paper. So, fake news produced by Mr. Trump, which are an enormous number, don't have judges. There is no judges. And if there is not some system of code of ethics of the big tech, we have a problem which is surmountable. Also because the big tech have a logarithm system which gives priority to the news which are catching, which are impacting, which are extraordinary, and therefore a large part of these are fake news. So I think we have a very serious problem with the big tech, which had hijacked the internet and brought in a different direction for what is citizen interest. First point. Second point, we cannot discuss about communication or even information without keeping into account that these are tools of social expression. In other words, it depends who we use in communication. Now, we live in a world of polarization, in a world where if you put a mask in the United States, you're left wing. If you don't put a mask, you're right wing. In a world where climate change has become left wing. In a world where this polarization has brought us to a world which absolutely make no sense. And yet, this is why internet, by giving to especially to the young people, the possibility to insulate themselves in a bubble which they create in a virtual world which they create, well, we have lost dialogue, we have a fragmentation of democracy, and we have another important point that today fake news are taken by people because they tend to reinforce what they already believe, which is something in marketing very well studied. In other words, I have a cartoon which is fantastic. I was trying to bring it here, but I'm not in Rome, where there is a young guy who said to his father, "Daddy, why do you say this is a fake news? It's exactly what I think." There is the reinforcement of stereotype, there is the reinforcement of bubbles, which is the biggest incentive for fake news. Now, a third observation is that while constitution and everything have created a world of values, the multilateral system is the expression of a world of common values. The coming nationalist and the fragmentation of democracy are eliminating values from the debate. Now, who speaks of solidarity? Who speaks of participation? Now, climate change is very, very much a question of solidarity. It's very, very much a question of participation. If you take the rug with values under the feet of people, well, we are not going very far. And this is why you have a clash of values between development and globalization. Development is a process in which when you enter and you end out, you are more than what you were. Globalization is a process in which if you enter and you end out, you have more than what you had. They are two completely different concepts. And
Roberto, I'm sorry to interrupt such a profound stream of thought. I wonder if you want to just wrap up this point, because I have to move on.
no, please, I already,
Okay.
that matter.
Well, I think you posed a big challenge to us because of, as you said, we have moved from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg, information communication. And I think it's true to say that the business models of these distribution mechanisms, they do encourage people to shout without thinking and to circulate without thinking, and because that's their business. So I think you're correct there. At the same time, somehow we need to, I think, find solutions for people to realize that if they want to shout or they want to circulate information on these platforms, they need to realize, for example, a weather event is not evidence of climate change or not evidence that climate is not changing. Weather and climate should not be confused, but most of the public would not realize that, and therefore they articulate with these platforms to produce misinformation.
May I just make an observation on the word of information, because I spoke only about the word of communication. The problem is that today media are not any longer a business. They do not make any longer money. Citizen came, today would be impossible. Therefore, media have become much more market-oriented and market-dependent than before. I give you two examples. One, international coverage is shrinking because it's too complicated for media, it costs too much. Second, analysis are gone. We only go on events, not process. How do you educate citizens without looking to process?
Yep, that's a great question. So now we're going to come to our search for some solutions, how to increase the supply of good information that may include also information debunking the bad information. So let's go in the same order again. And I want to ask the speakers as well to please monitor the chat, monitor the Q&A, because there could be some points in there that you want to address now, and if not now, I hope we can get time later. So let's have a quick focus on solutions. Try and aim for 4 minutes, if possible. And I'll wave again if I'm thinking that the time is coming up. So choose your best points for solution. Clément Boisseau, floor is yours. Please unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me? Oops.
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, I lost you for 1 minute, but now I'm back. So regarding the question of solutions, so I would say a couple of things. The first thing, I believe that people have much more power than they believe they have. Maybe in order to get better information, but also to have action. Because if you think about people, And if you think about people as consumers, for instance, we say that they have purchasing power. And in this expression, in purchasing power, you have the word power. They can choose to buy from a company rather than another one. They can choose to force companies to change their behaviors and to give better information, to improve the way they process, to improve how they produce what they produce. So I think that one of the solutions is to bet on people's smartness and ability to force corporations to change the way they operate. And you can always choose not to buy from someone you do not feel good with the values they stand for. So I think that it's a very first simple solution. It's to believe in people power to choose and to put pressure on corporation or on governments. So for me, it's the first very simple way to operate. The second thing, which is much more linked to my job, is that if you want to make people move ahead and inspire action and take action, you have to give them the willingness to do it, and you have to stimulate the desire to do it. And I think that you have to trigger what we call in our job the right insight, because most of the time people are super contradictory and paradoxical in what they aspire to and what they actually do. For instance, if you listen to the people, if you read a lot of research about what they expect from brands, from companies, from governments, you will monitor that they want to fight against climate change. They think that you have to ban the single use of plastic, for instance, or that SUVs are bad for the planet. So they are very good values. But when you look at what actually they do, when you look at their behaviors, they say, okay, I think that hybrid and electric cars are better, but I prefer to buy a SUV. So there's a lot of tensions and contradiction. And I think that we have to leverage these tensions to find solutions to make them change their behaviors. And I think that it's as a consequence in our job is that we have to shape new imaginaries, new desirable futures for the people. Because the thing is that for many decades, we have designed only one model, which was the one for saying that if you consume, if you follow everything, you will be happy. And I think that if we create new imaginary, if you change the storytelling, and if we show to the people that they can be as happy without consuming all the things that they used to consume, it will be a major step in order to change things. So I'm sure that we have to shape desirable future, to inspire action. And it means that if we touch base the subject of science in order to make people realize what they have to do and so on, we have to adopt a new storytelling, what I would qualify as an uplifting and positive tone of voice. We have to be super positive in the way to transmit information and to show the people that they have the ability to change things and they have the ability to change their behaviors and their way of living.
Thank you, Clément. Very, very interesting. I have a very quick question for you, and please answer in 1 minute, not more. Greta. Is Greta doing the kind of job that advertisers could be doing?
Not even in 1 minute, because in one word, yes.
Okay.
Of course, because I mean, she shows a journey. She shows that you can do things, and with one single and very simple idea. With she started with the school strike, and I think it's one single idea. It's what we would have called in our world an activation, and based on that, she showed the journey and she gave hope to people. So yes, she does this type of job, and the thing is, I'm sure that you have brands and companies that could do the same. And of course, it's a win-win solution for them because it's to sell things to the people. But if it's helped to change in a positive way, it's very important to do it.
Merci, merci. Paula, we're coming back to you for your 4 minutes on solutions. How do we find solutions to producing good content where it's needed.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really big challenge because the number one priority, at least where I come from, the number one concern that people have is around poverty and the link between poverty and perhaps a greater inequality that we are seeing. The growing inequality of Africa is driving more conflicts, it's driving more costs actually for our countries. And the link between this and climate change has not been articulated at all. And I think I really appreciate Martina's presentation because it really gets to the heart of this. I run a conservation organization. We do programs in schools, and we also produce television content. We produce a television series. It's the first ever wildlife television series produced in Africa by Africans for Africans. You know, Africa has more than 2 million filmmakers. They make films about, you know, hospital shows, soap operas, The Rich Always Cry, and all those kind of things. The demand and the consumption of media in Africa is enormous. More than 90% of Africans are watching television every day. This is a huge opportunity. This is why I said audience is really important. And the content on environment, the content on the importance of natural habitats as carbon sequestration, the importance of healthy soils, the importance of our forests has never really been articulated. Now, I talk about wildlife because people can relate to animals because we can see them, they're almost like people, right? Elephants have personalities. We can tell their stories, and storytelling can be very compelling and very uplifting. And the stories I tell are different from what you might see from David Attenborough or other films made by National Geographic and Disney. We tell stories about African role models and African heroes. So if Greta was an African, she would definitely be in my TV show. My series has been running for 1 year now. We have reached 51% of Kenyans, and we've been broadcast in 26 African countries. When we started, everybody told us Africans will not be interested. They don't care about animals. They're busy trying to make a living. Well, it's not true. Actually, if you have a good storytelling style, and if you've got great content, you will obviously get these audiences. And it doesn't have to be documentary. It could still be, soap opera style of storytelling to be effective. But I think that what's also really important, what's missing is this accountability from governments about the cost of the developments, the cost of our development agenda on future generations. This is what's missing. Our future generations are paying for the actions and the omissions of our people today. And if you think about Africa as a continent that is rising, we have the fastest growing cities in the world, the fastest growing economies in the world. Some of them are in Africa. And what are Africans doing? We are consuming a lot. The rich and aspiring Africans are consuming content from the West, and they therefore want to drive a nice big car. They want to travel to London, New York, Berlin, wherever. How do we make sure that Africa doesn't become the dirtiest continent in a few years, because these economies are growing and the population size is growing, and then the consumer demand from this continent is also rising, and that may be part of the reason why China is so interested in Africa, why China's presence here is so incredibly huge. It's not just about building infrastructure, it's about the market for Chinese products. And those products are being produced in a very climate unfriendly way in many cases. And also the bringing production to Africa in industries that are dirty as well. And we can see this in our cities. We see this in the quality of our rivers, the quality of our air, everything is deteriorating. And so I think we need to figure out a way of collaborating with our media houses across the continent in Africa, because I think Africa will be a very important continent to deal with, because it's going to be the slowest to take up clean energy solutions unless there are real acceptance by the people that when it comes to our elections, we vote for the Green Party. We don't even have green manifestos in our political parties. We need to create that awareness. So come elections, people are asking the right question when it comes to the presidential debates. And the time to do it is now. We have to bring on board those journalists and make sure that they are producing the right information and causing the public to ask the right questions, demand the right kind of developments as well. And in our school systems, we definitely need to bring this content into the classroom. So my television content is streamed directly into classrooms. We give these children lesson plans as well.
Well, thank you. I think that was really very solutions oriented. And although you have highlighted the African specifics, which are of course distinct and super important, a huge amount of what you said has got universal relevance also. Storytelling, for example, combating the omissions about the emissions, the need for content in schools. And so that gives us that. I think that was really rich. And so for everybody, and wishing you great success with the further growth of your TV series. Let's move on to Massimiliano. You have 4 minutes on the solutions. You need to unmute.
Okay, thanks to everyone for the suggestions, because again, this is helping us, like a brainstorming, to develop what the citizen platform was born for, to create through a debate the opportunity for scientists, journalists, information persons to evaluate each other in a peer evaluation process and, let's say, balance, fact check, and transfer the right information. Roberto Savio was saying that we are moving from the information era, from Citizen Kane, to the communication era. And Clement was saying creating a new imaginary is what communication can do. So Citizen Platform was born for that, to create, to give the power to empower people, citizens, and professionals in order to choose the right heroes, best practices, giving examples which can be tangible in order to answer to one of the questions which is on our chat. There is a question from Carolina Cipiro, I cannot give the right pronunciation, which is saying another thing, that science is never one thing. We have different ideas, and science is something that you can change because you are proving and demonstrating something which was new, and so on. How to inform regarding these two? Again, we need professional people. We need to empower people. We need to educate people. And the citizen platform is not a solution to everything, but can be a solution when people who are the members, who are the heroes, who are the ones who are driving this platform, can be the real drivers of the information and communication of the future. I was trying to reconnect these things in order to answer, and it's not a promotion. It's like saying this is the real soul of this platform. And there is another thing that I would like to add and close. We are living, we are human beings, so we are animals. We live of emotions. We are afraid, or we love something. These are the two main pillars which are moving everything. Fear, Mr. Trump, COVID, coronavirus, and so on, or fear, love, passion for something. I'm buying something that Clement was advertising because I'm appreciating that. If we remember this, we have to understand as citizens and debate and be able to look at things with a critical thinking approach. That what Roberto Savio was saying, we are living in a polarized society, in a fragmented democracy, is what's happening because of communication too. So sometimes there is something which is not ethical, someone that wants, sometimes if you're speaking of fake news, drive people in a particular direction. So how to empower people, empowering the single citizens, young generations through the local contents on the local TV in Africa or in the African continent, so giving to people the power to express themselves is the only way to fight, or not to fight, to work all together as a human being in the same direction. Sorry for this sort of political closing, but this is what we feel and I feel.
Thank you very much. And I think you are calling on citizens to become climate activists as well. So let's move to Roberto, because we're running out of time a little bit. Roberto Savio, your solutions. Give us your top 2 solutions in 4 minutes. Thank you. You should unmute.
We have reached the point where the system is not any longer functional and credible. Nobody is defending today the Washington consensus. I mean, we have no time to go into this, but I think this system is exhausted. Now, what happened in the last few years as a real movement on global issues? It's been climate, it's been women, and now it's been racism, which are global universal values. How people from the different parts of the world joined together because they felt that this part was something in their individual utopia, which was steered. I think that we have ability to steer people on global issues, which are the essential issue for today, if we make action. All these three things have come out because of action by some individual, but action. What is missing today in our society is action. Everything is left to government and corporation. Very little is left to citizens. I think that by citizen it will come out. I mean, for instance, citizen platform is an excellent instrument of empowerment. And so all the intervention which has been done represent some kind of empowerment. I am now in the middle of an experience. I started something called Other News, which is a service, daily service on global issues. Well, it's a very difficult material to read. Yet we have 13,000 people from all over the world reading daily. I think that people today need action and need idea for action, because everything is become stagnant. Nothing moves. Everything is done by corporation and governments. And that is not representing the real world. And if we continue like this, we will have another revolution, not like the Russian Revolution, but like the French Revolution, by people who don't accept any longer the system.
Thank you, Roberto. So we have the last word now from Martina Klims. Martina, your solutions.
I will just say the solutions, and now I would really like you to shift your mindset to more of the conflict-affected regions. That's where we work. That's where we see this difficult situation with water scarcity, as well as transboundary regions, basins, that rivers that are shared by more countries. So just imagine this context. And in this, our solutions are really to work with governments to increase their communication resilience. We at CV, we are coining this new term, calling it for communication resilience, because research and as well as lessons from other processes really show that it doesn't work to be responding to individual fake news, but we really need to work with the governments, with the communicators, with those who actually are accountable to the citizens, to really communicate about these challenges, these problems, and to be releasing data. and work with them. What is the best way to do this? What is the most effective way to do it? What do we need to think about? Now think about when we talk about water issues, we often see technical experts and experts, for example, on hydrology. It is difficult for them to find a very easy way how to transfer these complex messages, how to reach general public. And also in countries, post-conflict countries, often the support that came from external parties was more on heavy infrastructure, more on this, but there was a very little support on the communication side. There was not really any donor, and maybe there were some smaller projects, but more on a larger scale, that would work with these governments and really discuss this importance of communication. And these countries are so much targeted by different misinformation campaigns. So our solution is to really be working with the government actors and to be increasing their communication resilience. And of course, it's also important to be strengthening media, to have a good journalism, that we can actually create these stories that have the real information that can be shared when we have these incidents when disinformation is shared. But it's about the communication resilience.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that was a good sort of overview of the issues, because indeed, ultimately, it's governments that are representing people that should be acting to create an enabling environment for good information, and not be creating a disabling environment and not themselves be creating the bad information. And of course, as we've been discussing, the citizens have a key role, the companies have a key role, the media has a key role, the advertising agencies have a key role, the schools have a key role in producing this content. So we are coming to the end, and I really want to thank the speakers, because I think they've shared a lot of very rich ideas with us here. And we won't have time to go back to them, but I just want to ask my colleague Melissa to give us a sort of 3-minute summary or 4-minute summary of comments or questions in the chat if people didn't see them, and that you can take away some questions and think about them there. And then I'll ask Ricardo Grassi just to wrap up in the last minute. Unfortunately, I have to go at exactly 15:30, so we have 8 minutes left. Anyway, so Melissa, are you there? Can you unmute, and can you just give us the resume of comments and discussion in the chat?
Sure. So there's been quite a few questions and comments in the chat. I think our panelists have responded to quite a few of them as well. But I think there are a lot of questions about what are the next steps. For example, Marsha Kuluchi asked about what is the starting point for developing correct information on climate change and the environmental cost of productive activities without the risk of creating politicized discourse. And there are quite a few other comments which ask about how to balance this, how to balance information production and dissemination without really getting into politics and polarization, as Ms. Roberto Savio has mentioned earlier. And there are also a lot of questions about how the traditional media and media institutions can continue to contribute, especially in an era where social media and online platforms are becoming increasingly powerful. How can we continue to support our traditional media and ensure that independent journalism still exists? And I think that covers most of the comments that I've seen.
Super, thank you, Melissa. I'm going to, am I still muted? No, that's fine. So I'm going to pass up to Ricardo. He can tell us a bit on his side of the next steps. Let me say two last things quickly. The one is, I see somebody asked in the chat if they can get a certificate for participating in the webinar. My dear friend, let me tell you, you have a certificate of, a virtual certificate of fantastic learning from all these experts we've had and from the questions. So please, we're not doing a paper certificate, but you should put high value in your participation in this, and please take it forward. From the UNESCO side, we have another webinar coming up. Just I have the details here. on the 22nd of June at 1400, the same time as this. So please join us again for that last webinar. And on our side as UNESCO, we will keep on trying to get the kind of dialogue going between educators, journalists, scientists, and citizens on this really super important issue. Thank you again. And Ricardo, you may want to make some final remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guy. And I'm used to your expertise as a moderator, but I'm very pleased to see it once and more again. So thank you very much, because you do it in a very calm way. Yes. So I'm extremely happy with this webinar. I mean, it's been a sort of brainstorming, learning, underlining certain things that move us towards how to implement solutions. And there are some clear elements that come, and that has to do with how to communicate. The need of engagement, knocking doors, building alliances, networking, and like to avoid and eliminate forever what once we were called the alternative media, the alternative, and then eventually just speaking among the usual suspects. I mean, I think that all of us has an enormous amount of experience, of know-how, and the possibility of moving to another step, not to remain among the usual suspects, not to be on the little side of things, because a lot of things are happening. I mean, you see, when Paula is telling, well, we use TV, and this works when you have a good storytelling style. That means professional people engaging on this. I mean, because there are rules of the game. It's a profession. It's when Clement talks about his job. It's a métier, let's say, and you need to know the métier. And what we have to do together is to rethink narratives, to rethink how do we use this métier and this tool. Now, there's this point that comes on this, because there's an enormous imbalance between those very powerful controlling communication worldwide, and as it happened before with the news, the so-called transnational news agencies, and in a way were all supranational agencies. Now, in concrete terms, we have 5 mega corporations distributing and controlling the messaging, the bubbles, building the bubbles, etc., etc. Now, that's also points the aspect of funding. I mean, alliances, networking, inclusive, because we don't need to compete, but at the same time, the resources to really position all this in the proper way, well, it's something that we cannot avoid. It makes no sense in a way to continue talking and not thinking on the costs of the financial and economic cost of building an impact. But we do know, as Xavier was also pointing, that there are very clear points. I mean, climate change, women, the racial issue, I mean, there are very clear points where people is taking action. So we know that there's something looking for who from our sides are able to communicate properly, to impact with the message, the language, and the narrative that constructing a new paradigm is needed. And with this, I will close, and we will meet again next Monday, where we have people that represent the government and public institutions side, which meets some of the things that, well, Martina was underlining today. So we will have a Minister for Environment, we will have another important official on universities and research. We have a former Ministry of Foreign Relations, which is now a senator in Argentina. And we also have a great artist, photographer, and an activist from Bangladesh, which is Shahidul Alam, because this is the combination. The solutions is going beyond the confusion and inspiring action. I mean, the role models, the heroes, our heroes. We have heroes already. So, and in that opportunity, we will more formally and officially present this citizens platform on climate change and a sustainable world that we've been talking about, that we have the great thing of moving together with UNESCO. This is me.
Ricardo, that is a fantastic way to end this. So I now formally call it over for this session, and we look forward to the continuation. Thank you, everybody. It's been a wonderful dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll be in contact, huh? Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much to each one.